This episode of The Heart of Healthcare is brought to you by FlexSpa, the future of healthcare connectivity. Are you building a digital health platform? FlexSpa is here to help. FlexSpa simplifies patient onboarding, clinical trial participation, benefit administration, and plan enrollment with instant access to claims records, full payer coverage, and digital consent management. By integrating with FlexSpa solutions, developers can modernize their patient record retrieval, understand healthcare utilization and costs, and deliver truly personalized healthcare experiences. Head over to flexpa.com to learn more about what they're building. That's FLEXPA.com. Welcome to the Heart of Healthcare podcast. I'm Halle Tecco.
I'm Michael Esquivel.
And I'm Steve Krause. And every Monday, we bring you the latest in healthcare innovation as we sit down with entrepreneurs and industry experts.
So buckle up and join us as we figure out how to improve healthcare for all. Hello, listeners, and welcome back to the show. Today, we are speaking with someone who has brought the MRI into the mainstream dialogue. Andrew Lacy is the founder and CEO of Prenuvo, the full-body MRI scan available to anyone who can afford it. Prenuvo is challenging the core design of our healthcare system. Instead of waiting for you to get sick or show symptoms, they allow you to scan when you're still healthy with the goal of catching things early. Andrew, thanks for being here.
Thanks. It's awesome to hear. Great intro. I might use that in the future.
Hey, Andrew, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining today.
Thank you.
So this is your first endeavor in healthcare, and also you were not raised in the U.S. healthcare system. How did this distance from the chaos that we face in healthcare in the U.S. shape your vision for Prenuvo?
So I grew up in Australia, and Australia, like the UK, is a social medicine system. And people are always talking about the differences and expecting that I'll come with a sort of different perspective. But at the end of the day, whether you live in the US or you live in Australia, the only real difference is just who's paying for the healthcare, whether it's being directly paid for by an employer or whether it's being paid for by the government through our taxes. And all healthcare systems around the world, for the most part, are reactive. And so my experience with the healthcare system is the same as any of our experiences, which is if you're lucky, you go for an annual physical where they do some sort of cursory exam and tell you everything is fine when it may well not be. If you have mild symptoms, you're often told to, come back when things are more serious.
Or told that it must be in your head.
Common, and to be honest, for sure. But unfortunately, there's a lot of studies that show that indexes much more highly for women and for minorities. So that has a real cost to people's health, depending on, your sex and ethnicity. Yeah. And, I approached middle age. I was in my mid or sort of early 40s. I am a serial entrepreneur, which means that I have systemically abused my body for the last 20 years with way too much stress, not enough sleeping, horrible exercise routines, and bad eating. And I just looked in the mirror one day and said, hey, I have no idea if I'm going to embark on another company. I have no idea I'll be around to see the fruits of that labor. How do I get an answer to how I really am on the inside? And that sort of sent me off on my own personal journey to learn more about my health.
Dear friend of mine loves to say, we spend our youth sacrificing our health to earn money, and then we spend our later years spending our money to earn back our health. And it's just
so true.
Isn't that true? Isn't that one of the most sage lines? I mean, we spend our youth sacrificing our health to earn money, and we then spend our senior later years spending our money to earn back our health. It's crazy.
Yeah. Although the cycle feels like it's slightly breaking because you have these new Gen Zers that are like not drinking, they're exercising, they're looking out their health when they're young. So who knows?
They're not overworking. They're not into that. They're not into the grind. So when you were thinking about going in healthcare, you obviously landed on, I want to be able to look inside the body. But were there other things that you considered, other ideas that you kind of dabbled with before landing on Prenuvo?
Well, my first two companies weren't health companies, as you mentioned. My KPIs there were sort of how many, just not particularly things that were positive for the world. I have run an app company on the early iPhone ecosystem, and my KPI was how many billions of hours of your life had we wasted with you on our apps for the most part. So I wanted to have a better KPI, to be honest. I hoped that I'd learned something, and I wanted to work on an endeavor where, there was a more meaningful outcome for the world. And I actually worked on a few health companies, health ideas before landing on Prenuvo. I worked on an Alzheimer's diagnostic with a group out of Australia. I worked on a infant genomics idea with a few folks. But it was really my own experience with doing an early version of the Prenuvo scan that just, sometimes you just know when you experience something that you need to bring this to the rest of the world. And that was my experience with my first Prenuvo scan.
The initial scan that you did, did you come to that with your entrepreneur hat on, or was it like you were a patient?
I was a patient, and I also, to be honest, was looking at it. I was curious. I was always
curious
about MRI.
Patient.
Yeah. And I'd learned through my own entrepreneurial endeavors that, I didn't want to. It's very hard building companies. It's hard building companies that are sort of your own idea from the inception. So, I started to look for, really interesting ideas, people doing fascinating things that didn't really know how to grow or scale it. And so, I had heard about this guy who had people flying in to do these scans from the US, mind you. So medical tourism to Canada, which is pretty unheard of.
Wow.
That's where his clinic was. And so I went with both hats on, to be honest.
What was the machine? How was it different from a regular MRI machine at the time?
Yeah, the machine then and the machines we have now, they're custom-built research-grade MRI machines. So if I did a survey of the market in the US, there's probably only small sub 1% digit machines, so like 0.1% or 0.2%, 0.3% machines are capable of doing the imaging that we're doing. So the machines themselves are very unique. Every scan that you do, for any of your listeners that have done an MRI, you sit in that machine for a period of time, there's a bunch of sounds, and you get images at the end of the day. There's sort of inherent trade-offs that are very much bound up in the hardware that you use. So if you start with bad hardware, you just can't optimize towards a great scan. So that was the starting point for us, and that's why all of our clinics have this really high-grade MRIs that probably cost 2 times more than what you would see in a regular imaging clinic.
Have you experienced over time pushback from the medical establishment? I certainly have talked to numerous doctors who are saying, oh, this is just not the way to go. There's so many false positives. You create more anxiety for issues that probably were there at birth and aren't problems anyway. Just curious how you've encountered that as you've scaled Prenuvo.
Well, first of all, to address every one of those points probably would take the whole podcast, but there's sort of a meta point here as an entrepreneur, really, which is I've always been attracted to ideas that aren't conventional wisdom. And I think, I also do some investing, and you can think of sort of the average investment following a bell curve, normal distribution. And, you get pretty good after a while of telling the good investments from the bad investments, but it's really hard to tell the two tails apart. The most incredible transformative thing often sounds ridiculous to a lot of people in the very early days. So I've always wanted to sort of like play in the edges, shall we say, and found a lot of enjoyment in developing ideas, and sort of like it's really fun to help people change a well-established sort of worldview. And, so we
love that.
So for me, that's almost like it was sort of like an assumption. No matter what company I was going to be doing, it wasn't going to be a sort of like straight down the fairway, run-of-the-mill business. It would be something that would challenge the status quo. And I would say here I had such tremendous conviction because after I did my scan, I was so enamored by my own personal experience. I sat in this gentleman's clinic for 6 months and sat in about 150 consults with other patients that went through the same thing. And I saw people get all clear. I saw people told they had cancer, told people they had to go to the hospital immediately to deal with an aneurysm. They were told about wear and tear. So you imagine the range of, sort of like expand a wide range of outcomes. And the universal emotion that I experienced these people having was gratitude that they had information about their health finally. It didn't matter whether it was good information or what you would call, quote unquote, sort of bad information. It was, they finally understood something that was going on with them, and they felt like they had an agency to work on improving their outcomes. And that was, for me, that was all the conviction I needed. I think the rest is about education. And, we win doctors over one at a time.
I had the privilege of doing a Prenuvo scan in December of 2024. And it was a very fascinating set of information I received. I will say I wish I'd gotten the results a little faster. I think it was like 4 or 5 business days. And I'm sure there's a process that you have to go through to actually produce the results. And then, of course, I went to my doctor, and she and I just reviewed it together. And it was fascinating, though, because to your point earlier, I finally learned a lot more about my body, things that I didn't know, and that every human should know about themselves. And it was really, really powerful. But just in your experience, as you think about where this technology is going, is it going to be available to everybody?
Well, Michael, there's no reason why it shouldn't be. It's just a question of scale and will, really, to look at healthcare a different way. I mean, we spend so much money, ridiculous amounts of money treating late-stage cancer. There's something like $250 billion there. We spend another $1 trillion treating chronic kidney disease and chronic liver disease in the US. We could screen everyone in the US once every 2 years for probably about $100 billion. Wow. And those screenings would catch the vast majority of cancers early, would catch the vast majority of chronic conditions early enough, before they become chronic, so you can actually do something about them and change the trajectory of that disease. I fundamentally believe if these scans and, other tests, comprehensive blood, for example, was really a part of the health system at its root, you probably would need a healthcare system that would be half the size it is today, and it would yield much better outcomes for all of us.
Are you talking to health plans then? Are you seeing if you can get this covered?
We are open for discussions with any health plans. We're talking to a lot of employers. Again, in the US, we think of the health plan as being the decision maker, but really it's the large employers. They can tell a health plan to cover anything. And large employers often, particularly the ones that have loyal employees, which tend to be more traditional industries than, say, the newer high-tech industries where people move around a lot, they can look at this and say, well, if I provide these scans for someone who's going to be an employee with me for 10, 20 years, there's a really good ROI on that. And so we're also going through the process of educating the large companies and enterprises to consider adding these to their health plans.
Where do you see, Andrew, so I know the cost of these things tend to run in the couple $1,000s range today. Where do you see it going? That is always one of the big pushbacks. Even when I've talked to colleagues at Fenwick, it's like, wow, it's expensive. I don't know if I want to do it. And, they just know I'm this crazy health data nerd that wants to learn about my body in any way I can. So, where do you see that price point heading in the future?
Just to respond to your Fenwick friends, these are probably people that they're wearing their $900 Apple Watch, and they've got their Fitbit, that's tracking their steps. So they're spending all this money tracking the state of their REM sleep. And
for sure,
not tracking the state of their health. So I think some part of it is just, it's a new category of spend. We don't quite know how to contextualize it. Is it a medical expense, or do I put in a mental bucket where I put buying organic food or going to, having an Equinox membership? Is it in that category of these are the things I do for myself in order to stay healthy? And I think, we have a lot of, that's where I would put it personally. And on the cost side, these scans need to become more, less expensive. Having said that, I think in the US, we haven't changed our prices for 15 years, which means they're 50% cheaper.
Right.
The average, if you go to a large academic hospital to get a single body part MRI, oftentimes they'll charge the insurance company $20,000, and your out of pocket will be the same cost as our scan across the entire body.
Have you guys changed your pricing since you've launched?
No. We've sold a scan for $24.99 since 2009.
Yeah. Do you think it will go down?
Well, we can always make them cheaper and faster. The question is always, and you'll see out there that there are people saying, hey, we can do this in 20 minutes or for much less expensive. But the challenge always is, like getting the right balance between, in order to make sure that the scans themselves are clinical and they yield clinical quality outcomes. Because what a lot of people don't appreciate about MRI is it's a qualitative imaging modality. So, my first company was on iPhone, so I know a lot about mobile phones. My 1995 Nokia cell phone could take photos. My iPhone 16 can take photos. They both have that same fundamental functionality. But the photos on the iPhone 16 are 100 times better than the photos on my sort of Nokia phone from 20 years ago or 30 years ago now. So, this hardware is really important, and there are just a lot of trade-offs. There's hard physics that you can't overcome. A 10-minute scan or a 20-minute scan will never be as good as a 60-minute scan.
Yeah.
And the faster you do it, the more false negatives you get and the more false positives you get. So the challenge I always have, I have a medical leadership team that helps us decide what quality we need of what parts of the body to feel like we're diagnostic quality across the exam. And we're always making trade-offs. When the hardware improves, we can bring the scan time down. If there's AI that we can bring that can help us speed up image acquisition without sacrificing quality, we do that. So we're always sort of tweaking the protocols, but fundamentally, this technology is a little bit limited by the physics of MRI.
The cost of the clinicians, the cost of the actual physical space is not going to go down. You're really like the machines, it's like, can you get the cost of the machines down? And as we know, in innovation in every other industry, the price only goes down. Think about TVs, cell phones, but in healthcare, like innovation never gets cheaper.
If you needed heart surgery, I'm pretty sure you would research where you wanted to go and get that surgery done. Like you appreciate and understand that there are great heart surgeons and there are probably not so great heart surgeons. And if your life depends on it, you want to find a great one. I think what people don't fully appreciate around MRI and a lot of other medical tests, frankly, is that the outcome is very dependent on sort of the company that actually is conducting the test. And you want to make sure that that company really takes the service very seriously, that they have a medical leadership, that they operate their own clinics, that they really understand the hardware, that they calibrate these things. And because every one of those, if you remove any one of those things, you start ending up with something that is much less accurate.
That's a great point.
People don't realize that. I had a child 2 years ago, and even things like a HCG test, if you talk to people that really understand blood testing, they'll say you should go back to the same lab every time to get that HCG level checked, because if you're doing that test on other equipment, your HCG might go up or down, and you might think that something's going on with the pregnancy when it isn't. So it really matters. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of consumers, this is complex technology, and it's really hard to really understand the extent to which it does matter. I'll give a really instructive example. We do a very detailed scan of your brain in our exams. We actually do a sequence on your brain that is typically only done in Alzheimer's patients. And this is one of the areas where we have more data. We have more brain scans than anyone else in the world. And what's kind of cool is these are not just people with dementia, which is what the scans that other people have, but it's like the spectrum. Yeah. Healthy 18-year-olds all the way to healthy 100-year-olds, and then unhealthy people in between. And those brain scans are very sensitive. I mean, we're looking and trying to understand, is your brain volume changing from one scan to the next 2 or 3%? And we have to calibrate all our machines to each other because, and we try and bring people in at the same time of the day even, because it can significantly affect this very minor changes in brain volume. And if you go somewhere, and if you get a Prenuvo scan and then go somewhere else and do the same scan, they might say your brain grew 10% or shrunk 10%. And if it grows 10%, you feel pretty good about yourself. Unfortunately, you can't do that as adults. It doesn't keep growing. But if it shrunk 10%, you want to make sure that's a real change. Otherwise, that can cause a lot of anxiety.
Well, you just brought up something I did want to talk about, is that Prenuvo now has the largest repository of whole body MRI imaging in the world, including of the brain. What are you going to do with this data?
Well, I think there's two things that we're really interested in doing. One is, what can we learn from this data, both as an individual snapshot sort of put together and also longitudinally, to really understand the origins of disease? So can we find these imaging-based biomarkers for very, very early stage chronic disease? For example, what we know now with the brain is by the time you have dementia, you've already lost a lot of brain volume. We can obviously track the change in brain volume over time. But before you lose brain volume, the corticals on the outside of the brain start to flatten out. These are sort of the ridges that are on the outside of the brain. Before they flatten out, we're starting to understand that you actually start to see perfusion changes in the brain. So now we have this advanced brain scan where you can actually look at perfusion in the brain and understand this is sort of how blood is sort of like moving around the structure of the brain, and really understand where you might have potential, let's call it plumbing issues that can be, ideally improved through lifestyle modification. So it's sort of like, how can we turn back the clock? Because those perfusion changes, we believe, predate dementia by like potentially 20 years. At a time when you can still do something about it with your lifestyle, maybe with drugs or new medications that target very early stage disease, sort of call it like a statin for your brain. And the same is true, we believe, for all these different organs. So that's sort of the first use of having this data set, is you start to see patterns. The second is we're doing a lot of AI. And the AI there is really designed to do two things. The first is to help us diagnose disease. And one grand vision in the future is that, in fact, AI can do most of the heavy lifting, that AI can actually diagnose most of what we see, and the radiologist becomes something that we use by exception. Now, we're still a ways away from that, but in the UK recently, there was mammograms can now be second read by AI. That happened in the last year. So the regulators are starting to understand that, AI can do a pretty good job of, a lot of these things that radiologists are doing. And then the second thing is really identifying insights into how the way you're living your life is impacting your body. So be able to look at every organ in the body or your spine or your brain and be able to say, okay, you're 40, but your brain looks like you're 50. Good news, your liver looks like you're 30. Your spine looks like you're 55. And so you can start really getting personalized insights into what you should focus on as an individual. And I think that's going to be really powerful for a powerful positive catalyst for change.
And are researchers reaching out about like collaborating and using your data in their...
Yes. Things have changed a lot. And we started the company 6 years ago. No one wanted to talk to us. Everyone wanted to dismiss what we were doing as sort of silly. I would say 6 years later now, there are physicians that are enthusiastic. There are a lot of physicians that are like neutral, but there are way fewer that are negative. And by the way, neutral feels way better than negative, from the company building point of view. And then there's a lot of institutions that we're now forming research partnerships with to do joint research around some of these biomarkers of disease. And we've published papers in the last year or two and intend to increase the rhythm of that going forward.
I'm really, really quite encouraged by what you're all doing there. So thank you on behalf of so many of us that are eager and desperate to get to that future, that we can avoid some of these some of the fates that our families experience and that our predecessors experienced.
Well, I just think it should be a fundamental human right to know the state of your health. And I believe that it's, unfortunately, because I see this, in fact, there was a study in the UK a couple of years ago where they looked at sort of the sort of clinical pathways that led to cancer. And the average cancer diagnosis was early stage 3 in the UK. And that pathway took anywhere from like 6 to 9 months and involved something like a dozen doctor and specialist visits. So it's a very, diagnosis is actually a really time-intensive process, not just for doctors, but also for patients. Now, if you're not feeling well, and there might be something going on with you, who is going to have the time to resolve that as quickly as possible? Is it the person working at Fenwick? Or is it the, single mom that's working 2 jobs and doesn't have any childcare? So early diagnosis is not only a universal right, I believe, but it can be like a real equalizer for healthcare, because most health systems do a pretty good job of treatment. That's never the problem. The problem is, how do you get diagnosis to universally happen a lot faster?
I want to talk about working in a space that is controversial, is not fully accepted. I helped co-found a company in the egg freezing and donation space, so I know a lot about this. Thinking about also GLP-1s, there are areas where there's an opportunity to make a real difference, but there's also a lot of misunderstanding, and there's frankly some fly-by-night operations that are sketchy. And I recently posted about one that I saw. It was a telehealth company trying to promote GLP-1s, and it was just breaking all sorts of FTC and FDA laws around what had to be disclosed and whatnot. And you actually reached out to me to tell me that there were some companies in your space that you were also kind of concerned about Can you talk about just trying to stay ahead of the curve, being a leader in a space that there could be bad actors, and how to separate yourself from them? And also just give us the tea on what the bad guys are doing.
I don't have a solution, to be honest. I mean, we in our space, we created a lot of buzz around this space. And of course, when you create a lot of buzz, there's going to be other folks that take interest in the space. And there's a lot of people out there that have MRI machines or have access, can arrange access to MRI machines that think, well, if Prenuvo can do this, then I can do this too. And they're doing faster scans that aren't clinical diagnostic. They're sort of touting oftentimes that, they have some special AI source that makes things, that means that, we can take a 10-minute scan and it's going to be as good as an hour scan. And, we reach out to them and say, look, I have no problems with competition. I think competition is a good thing fundamentally. And my biggest competitor right now is just lack of awareness amongst consumers that what we do even exists. But I'm very sensitive to consumers being misled.
Yeah.
And look, if that's being misled about, I don't know, something, some other consumer purchase you might make, what phone you want to buy, or, a dress that you're going to purchase or something, that's not going to be a big problem. But health can really, it's so fundamental and it's so important that I think it's necessary that people give informed consent when they decide to do a service. And informed consent requires them really understanding the benefits and the risks and how a given procedure compares to what else they might be able to have out there. And I just think a lot of folks, there are these sort of companies that are like consumer wrappers around healthcare. And we see this in our space and we see this in other spaces as well. And I'm not sure, because they're not at the core clinical businesses, I don't think they're very sensitive to just how important it is to communicate clearly to consumers. And, I'm nervous, they almost take a sort of YouTube grew into this behemoth because they use copyright materials and, and their philosophy was let's just, when we get big enough, we can fix all the problems later on. And I don't think that strategy is appropriate in the health space, but I see companies approaching health that way.
Yeah, this is human life, for crying out loud. This is not videos. Yeah. So totally get that. So Andrew, how do you break through that noise? I mean, I remember talking to people early on about, well, an X-ray is an X-ray, an MRI is an MRI. How do you break through that noise? Because I've learned some things here today about the clinical diagnostic standards and stuff that you all apply. But beyond brand and messaging, how is Prenuvo going to break through that noise and be the gold standard that we then expect and demand from these scans?
There's two answers. The first is, this is a bit old-fashioned, but let's just focus on providing a really great service, on providing life-saving diagnoses, on having a great in-clinic experience, on being highly accurate, and the business will grow through word of mouth as a result. And that's sort of historically how we've grown. We haven't done a lot of advertising. We only just started doing this. I'm not even sure we're particularly good at it. We're learning. But, probably 80 or 90% of people come in because they've heard about us from a friend, a neighbor, right, a family member, and so on. And I think that's just sort of it's a nice way to grow, because you only grow as fast as your ability to deliver a great product. And, Kim Kardashian and other celebrities talking about us it's a reflection of word of mouth. Obviously they have a tremendous audience, but people like him come in and get scans and they think it's incredible, and they hear about us saving a life or two of people that they know in their circles, and they want to talk about it. And we sort of lean into that. So I'm very unapologetic around this.
And that's how I feel like that really puts you guys on the map, and also made it so it wasn't just this nerdy, it wasn't just Michael Esquivel in there.
Always picking on me, Halle. Always picking on me. I'm such an easy target.
So did Kim come in organically on her own and then promote it, or was she like an influencer that your team coordinated?
No, all of these people for the most part came in just independently, including Kim.
Wow.
And I don't have a single quote unquote influencer contract with any single person that spoke, anyone in the history of the company who's spoken about us. So it's organic. Now we lean into it and we just try and be the friendliest. We just try and be the friendliest, nicest, enthusiastic people about what we're doing.
Yeah.
And make the time to meet with some of these people and, really explain to them this. And of course, if they tell their audiences, they will save lives.
Yeah.
I mean, just by virtue of the fact that the number of people that are listening. And who doesn't want to do that? And what's the cost, to talk positively about a experience that you actually appreciated yourself? I'm like really unapologetic about it. I think I'm if you see me in the clinic, I often will talk to people in the waiting room, and it doesn't matter whether it's Kim or it's like someone's mother, it's, why are you here? What was your experience like?
Yeah.
I got a favor to ask you, tell more people about it.
Yeah.
Because the reality, this is one of these companies where the reality is even better than the hype. So there you go.
So Kim, though, really solidified the brand image as a premium luxury product and experience, and coupled with the price tag. But what I am hearing from you is like, you're okay with that because it's actually comparable to what you would pay at a hospital. You're not trying to be an elitist product, but it's healthcare, and healthcare, quality healthcare is expensive.
I think it's a little complicated because, again, it comes back to what do people think they're getting when they're getting one of these scans. So I could tell you, breaking news, the fastest whole body scan I could provide today is about 3 minutes. And it would look at every organ in the body. And of course, if it was if I offered a 3-minute scan, I would be able to offer that a lot cheaper. The challenge is it just would have many more false negatives and more false positives. Now, if there were a way to really have consumers understand that, there might be a way to introduce that product, but I'm sure doctors wouldn't like it. But it is possible. There are sort of like lower fidelity versions of these things that you could do, and I just don't think it's hard enough to explain to people what we do today. And I think the assumption when people are doing these scans is, there's something of an implicit guarantee here that if you tell me I don't have something, I don't have something. And at least within the limits of medicine, right? And if you do those low fidelity scans, I mean, you may miss a 3-4 centimeter tumor, like not something that's small.
Yeah.
And so it's just hard to come up with a product that consumers can really intuitively understand, is not as high quality as what you would maybe expect.
Yeah. Could you say you guys are like the Volvo? You're like, it's going to be high quality. It's not cheap, but it's also not a Range Rover or a Mercedes G-Class.
Yeah. But to be clear, there are no safety standards in this sort of class of product. So, someone can literally offer, I could make a car in my backyard and sort of stick it together with Band-Aids and can call that like a whole body scan. And, there are no standards at all. So whatever standards anyone is sort of adhering to in this space are standards that they have self-imposed. And I have 100 medical practitioners in my company, 70 plus board certified radiologists, and they are not comfortable cutting corners in a way that can obviously negatively impact consumers and frankly impact their license, because at the end of the day, they're the ones that are signing off on reports based on the images that we collect. And you can't scale to 70 radiologists without having great images. There's just not enough radiologists willing to take that risk.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that maybe the technology, to conclude, maybe the technology will improve and we can bring the price down. I'm sure we can over time with scale bring this down. But in the context of a healthcare system where the average spend per person is like $15,000 in the US, $10,000 to $15,000 in the US now, let's call it $1,000 to $2,000 scan, if we could bring the cost down a bit, paid for by the healthcare system, where you probably save 2 to 3x in terms of not having to spend money on late diagnosis, that feels like a great deal for the health system.
For sure.
And the alternative is pretty shocking, because with aging populations, healthcare will literally bankrupt most economies. And it's sort of the conversation that people aren't having today, but they'll start having in the coming years.
Yeah, you raised an earlier point, Andrew, about in the tech ecosystem, at least, you see a lot of, movement. And so the investment for employers sometimes can be a tricky one if the average tenure of an employee is 3 years and not, as you mentioned earlier, in sort of more traditional businesses or even countries like Japan where employees are there for 50 years. It's a very, very
But employers they're still, they're smart decision makers. I mean, especially large self-insured employers. And this might be an opportunity to deliver a really incredible benefit to a blue collar employer who has employees that, work with them from cradle to grave. And, they want to be a real partner. I'll give you some examples. We work with a lot of fire departments in the US. There's a much higher occupational risk of cancer in those departments, and they're unionized and their union has some say into what healthcare is provided. And oftentimes those contracts even provide for healthcare after the firefighter retires.
Right.
So they're really heavily invested in reducing their healthcare costs through early detection. So a lot of those like more traditional blue collar employers that have been passed over by all the other sort of benefits, right. that we, right. that have been bestowed upon like Google and Facebook. I mean, those guys may be like the biggest beneficiaries of these types of services that we offer.
Yeah. Super fascinating.
We just had the Color CEO on. He was telling us about working with the airlines and folks there. So they're also privy to supporting blue collar workers who deserve this care as much as everyone else.
Hear, Halle. Hear.
Yeah, I think
so.
Well,
Andrew, it was great chatting with you. Thank you so much for sharing. And for folks listening, if you're interested in Prenuvo, they've generously given us a coupon code. So we're going to drop it in the show notes and let us know what you think of it. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Heart of Healthcare. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please leave a rating and review, and don't forget to subscribe. The Heart of Healthcare is produced by Halle Tecco and hosted by Michael Esquivel, Steve Krause, and Halle Tecco. The show is engineered, edited, and mixed by Kyle Moore. Visit our website, heartofhealthcarepodcast.com, for show notes and details.
In the time it takes you to actually board that flight from Group 8...
Now boarding Premier Altitude Elite Club members.
You could have bought a Hyundai on Amazon. Yes, that Amazon, where you buy everything else.
Mid-tier Altitude Elite, feel free to board now.
So while you're waiting for them to make up new boarding groups, you can order your dream car and the dealer will have it ready in no time.
Now boarding Groups 1 through 7.
So close. Visit HyundaiUSA.com or call 562-314-4603 for more details. Limited availability, pickup through participating Hyundai dealer in select markets.